For this project, I'll be using a pencil, a ruler, watercolor paper, paintbrush, and some watercolor paint, of course. I will also be using a variety of other materials like saran wrap or plastic wrap, a little bit of wax paper, a Kleenex, an eyedropper. If you don't have this, it's not a huge deal. You can do the same effect with your paintbrush. A white crayon, and yeah, that's about it. Oh, salt. Don't forget salt. I just use regular table salt, but any salt works. Okay, time to get started. I have my watercolor paper. I'm going to divide it in half with the ruler. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here and draw a line with my pencil horizontal. And then I'm also going to divide it in half vertically. So I'm going to draw a vertical line right down the middle. Also just kind of eyeballing it. It's okay if it's not perfect. Then I'm going to divide those sections in half as well and make two more vertical lines, one on the left and one on the right. This should divide my paper into 8 sections, and that is what we will work with today for our project. Time for the fun part. So I wanted to show you some different watercolor techniques. I'll do one technique in each section. I'm going to start with this first section here. I'm getting my brush wet, and I'm going to start with kind of a rosy red color. Really, you can do this with any color you want. I'm trying to make sure it's nice and wet, and it doesn't matter if you go all the way to the edges of the section. In fact, I'm going to try to leave a little bit of space, especially by my pencil lines, and that way my watercolor won't all mix together when I work on the next sections. So I got it nice and wet. Now I'm going to add lots more paint. So I'm just dipping my brush in my red paint, and I'm dropping a bunch more into this section while it's still wet, so I get a nice dark rich color. If you want to, you could even add other colors as well. I'm just going to try to stick with 1 to 2 colors each time. Now I'm taking my plastic wrap, and I'm going to lay the corner of it on top of my shape. And I really want some wrinkles to happen, so I'm going to kind of squish it together with my fingers to get some wrinkles underneath the plastic wrap. Just like that. I'm going to make sure it covers all of the shape, and I'm going to let it sit. Leave it alone. Don't touch it. Time to move on. Second shape, I'm going to use more of an orangey color. I'm going to try to fill it up. Again, I'm not going right up to the edges. If I were to go to the edges, the colors would mix and blend. It's not a big deal considering I'm using colors that are similar, but if you don't want your colors to mix, leave some space. The paint will only go where the water is. Again, I'm filling this with lots of really bright color. I'm going back in and adding more paint even while the water is wet. And the paint will go anywhere that water is, so it'll kind of spread out into the water. Dropping in some yellows and oranges. Now I'm going to take my wax paper, and I don't need a piece this big, so I'm going to kind of rip it into a piece that will work that's a little bit smaller for this section of my project. I'm going to go ahead and lay the wax paper down, and make sure you just push all the way down so that it gets a good connection to the paint. Again, I'm going to leave that sit and not touch it. On to number 3. This one I want to go a little bit lighter, like more of a yellowy color. I'm going to go ahead and fill this shape in with paint. I'm using Shinhan Pro watercolor. It's one of my favorites because it's nice and bright and it's pretty reasonably priced, but any watercolor brand would work. The professional quality paints will give you probably brighter colors, but you could even do this with like liquid watercolor. Those are usually pretty bright too. All right, drop some yellow. I'm adding just a couple sections of orange as well while it's still wet, just to give a variety of color. Now I'm taking my table salt and doing a pinch, and then I'm sprinkling it on the wet paint. Now this only works if your paint is wet, so make sure you do it right away while the paint is still wet. We'll let that dry and move on to the fourth spot. For this one, I'm going to start getting into kind of a yellow and green or a light green look. Filling this up with green. Nice and watery. While it's wet, I can add a couple more areas of paint just to make sure it's nice and saturated and bright. And now I'm going to use my Kleenex, and I'm going to kind of wrinkle it up a little bit. Paper towel works too. And I'm just going to dab it once, twice, 3 times. And that's it. We'll let that sit. Got my top row done. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to my bottom row. For this one, I'm going to use a darker green. It's more of a blue-green color. You could always mix some blue and green together, and that would work well for this one too. I'm going to fill this one up with color. And then in this square, I'm going to scratch some paint out, and I actually need to let it sit just a little bit before I do that. If you do it while it's super wet, the scratching doesn't work quite as well. So I'm getting this wet, I'm filling it in with color, and I'm just going to let it sit for a minute and move on to the next square, because I will wait and do the scratching once it's kind of settled into the paper. You want to do it when it's kind of damp, but not completely dry. My next one, I'm going to take a white crayon and just make some marks through the area. I'm making some zigzag lines, some straight lines, and some curly lines. And it's kind of hard because you can't really see what you're doing, so you just have to kind of be aware about where you've already been. This is a wax resist method, so the crayon is made out of wax, and wax and watercolor don't work together. So the wax will stay on the paper, and you'll see as I paint over it, you can still see the crayon. Leaves whatever kind of pattern or design that you put in. Pretty cool. The wax is saying, I don't think so, watercolor, can't come here. Okay, so my green one is damp, and now is a good time to start using the back of my brush to draw some lines in it. I probably could have even waited a tiny bit longer because it's still a little bit wet, but you can basically scratch out patterns. The back of my brush is also very round. It works probably better if you have a straighter edge, and some of my brushes have more of an angle to them, so they might work even better, but you get the idea. You can kind of scratch out patterns or designs. It makes for just some interesting things going on with the watercolor paint. On to my 7th spot. So this one I'm going to get wet with just plain water first. I just want to kind of get it damp, and then I'm going to be dropping some paint into it, which is really a fun technique. I'm going to take my brush and dip it in some blue without much water on it, and just kind of touch and then move on, touch, move on, touch, move on. And you can see like it'll start just kind of gradually spreading out to where the paper is wet. Almost kind of like a tie-dye effect. It's kind of cool. Then I'm going to take my dropper and I'm going to put some water in it. And I'm just going to drip a little bit of water on top of some of these dots. And it just kind of makes them like explode. It's super fun to play with. If you do not have a dropper, you can do the same effect just by getting a bunch of water on your brush and kind of tapping your brush down with just clean water again. So you can do as much of this or as little as possible. The water just kind of moves the paint around and kind of makes it spread. Do not take your brush and brush stroke any of those areas because it just kind of let the paint do its thing. All right, this last one I wanted to show you a gradient wash. A gradient wash is where you gradually move from one color to another. It usually works best if the paper is damp or wet. So I'm getting my area wet with clean water, and I'm going to start dropping in some colors, actually brushing in some colors. So I'll start with the red on top and just do a nice soft brush stroke, a horizontal brush stroke. Then I'm going to go into the orange, and they touch each other so you can see they'll just kind of gradually blend together because it's already wet. Move to the yellow. Move to the green. Colors are gradually blending together. Move to more of a blue-green. Try to get more into the blues. And ideally some purple on the bottom. Now sometimes too you can even angle your paper to kind of help the colors flow into each other, but I don't know, they're flowing pretty well just by leaving my paper flat. Now I'm going to let these all dry. I will come back later and check to see how they're doing. Okay, dry. Time to take off my plastic wrap and my wax paper. Now you can see all the different effects that we have using these watercolor techniques. Oh, so cool. Just love these. Now I have a paper egg that I cut out, and I'm going to trace the egg on each of these shapes. Now you could do whatever you want with these. You could just leave them and call this a masterpiece, or maybe you could make letters from each of the different ones that you made. I just thought it would be fun to make kind of like Easter eggs with all of the different shapes, all of the different techniques. So I am tracing my egg on each spot, and then I will cut all of these shapes out. Now there are so many things you could do with these eggs once you cut them out. It does not have to end here. If you want to, you could take like Sharpies or some kind of paint markers and add even more designs or lines on them to decorate the eggs. Lots of ideas. You could maybe make a background. You could put a bunch of grass or design your own basket. You could even paper weave a basket and then add all of these eggs inside. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and had fun playing with these watercolor techniques. There's so many fun things you can do with watercolor paints. And I hope that you come up with something super creative to do with all of these adorable eggs or whatever you decide to cut out of your little shapes. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see what you guys create. We'll see you next time.